The transport lurched beneath Major General Harukichi Hayakutake's boots as the escort destroyer cut through the Solomon Sea the morning of August 20th, 1942, bringing news that seemed impossible. His staff officer's hands trembled as he held the reconnaissance report, not from fear of the enemy, but from the sheer absurdity of what the photographs showed. Where 11 days ago there had been coconut groves and raw jungle on Guadalcanal's northern plain, there now stood a completed airfield, not a crude landing strip, not a temporary runway hacked from the trees, a fully operational airbase with packed coral runways, revetments, fuel dumps, and support structures that would have taken Japanese engineers months to construct, if they could have built it at all. Hayakutake read the intelligence summary 3 times, certain there had been an error in translation. The Americans had landed on August 7th. Today was August 20th, 11 days. The photographs showed what his most optimistic engineers claimed would require 16 weeks of work, assuming ideal conditions, unlimited resources, and a construction battalion twice the size of what the Americans could have possibly landed on that first day. Yet there it sat, undeniable in the harsh clarity of aerial reconnaissance. Henderson Field, named after a Marine aviator killed at Midway, already receiving aircraft. The general felt something he had not experienced since the war began, not fear, but a cold recognition that perhaps the intelligence briefings in Tokyo had been catastrophically wrong about something fundamental. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The construction of Henderson Field represented more than a tactical surprise. It was evidence of an industrial and organizational capacity that contradicted everything the Japanese High Command had been told about American capabilities. This is the story of how 11 days of American engineering work shattered the assumptions that had led Japan into the Pacific War, told through the eyes of those who watched their strategic calculations collapse in real time. To understand the shock that rippled through Japanese command when they realized what had been built on Guadalcanal, you must first understand the foundation of Japanese strategic thinking in 1942. The entire edifice of Japan's war plan rested on a specific belief about American character and capability, a belief that had been carefully constructed through years of propaganda, cultural assumptions, and selective intelligence that confirmed what Tokyo wanted to hear. The prevailing doctrine, articulated by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto before Pearl Harbor and embedded in every level of military planning, held that Americans were soft, individualistic, and lacked the spiritual strength for protracted war. More critically, for understanding Guadalcanal, Japanese planners believed Americans lacked the engineering efficiency and work discipline that characterized Japanese military construction. This was not merely racist assumption, though that played its role, but appeared to be confirmed by intelligence assessments of American peacetime construction practices, which emphasized safety regulations, labor negotiations, and what Japanese observers interpreted as wasteful deliberation. Japanese military engineers prided themselves on their ability to construct fortifications and airfields under austere conditions. In China, in Manchuria, across the newly conquered territories of Southeast Asia, Japanese construction battalions had demonstrated remarkable capability. They worked with minimal equipment, incorporated local labor through varying degrees of coercion, and produced functional military infrastructure in climates and terrain that would challenge any army. At Rabaul, the primary Japanese base in the South Pacific, engineers had spent months developing the Airfield complex, incorporating the lessons learned from years of expeditionary warfare. The standard Japanese estimate for constructing a bomber-capable airfield in jungle terrain assumed 4 months of work by a dedicated construction regiment of approximately 3,000 men. This estimate included clearing vegetation, grading the ground, establishing proper drainage, surfacing the runway with crushed coral or other suitable material, and building the essential support structures, fuel storage, ammunition bunkers, repair facilities, and defensive positions. Japanese planners knew from hard experience that every day of this timeline was necessary. Shortcuts in construction meant airfields that degraded rapidly under tropical rains, creating maintenance nightmares and operational limitations. When Japanese reconnaissance flights first observed American activity on Guadalcanal in early August, the initial assessment was almost dismissive. Radio intercepts and Coast Watcher reports indicated a landing force of roughly 10 to 11,000 Marines. Intelligence officers in Rabaul calculated that perhaps 1/10 of that force might be engineers or construction troops, standard military proportions. Even assuming the Americans brought heavy equipment, which seemed unlikely given the scale of the landing and the need to prioritize combat troops, Japanese planners estimated the Americans might have a crude landing strip operational in 6 to 8 weeks, weather permitting. This matched Japanese doctrine and experience. What the Japanese did not know, could not have known from their intelligence framework, was that the American force included not just engineers, but a completely different type of unit, the Navy's construction battalions, soon to be immortalized as the Seabees. The 1st Marine Division that landed on Guadalcanal brought with them the 6th Naval Construction Battalion, supplemented by engineers from the 1st Marine Engineer Battalion and the 1st Pioneer Battalion. This combined force represented something new in military organization. Construction specialists who were trained as fighters, equipped with an unprecedented array of heavy machinery, and organized around industrial efficiency principles that had nothing to do with traditional military engineering. The Seabees were older than typical military recruits, many in their 30s and 40s, because the Navy had specifically recruited men with civilian construction experience. These were professional carpenters, equipment operators, electricians, and foremen who had built highways, bridges, and structures across Depression-era America. They brought with them not just skills, but an industrial mindset shaped by American commercial construction practices, where time was money and efficiency was measured in yards of earth moved per hour, tons of material processed per day, and structures completed ahead of schedule to maximize profit. Lieutenant Colonel Merrill B. Twining, the division intelligence officer who had conducted the pre-invasion reconnaissance, had identified the airfield site specifically because it had already been partially cleared by the Japanese. Ironically, Japanese construction troops had begun work on the airfield in July, recognizing the strategic value of Guadalcanal's northern plain. They had cleared some vegetation and completed preliminary surveys before the American landing forced their hasty evacuation. The Japanese had planned to develop the field slowly, bringing in equipment and supplies over months, building infrastructure to support the construction effort before attempting the runway itself. The Americans had a different approach. They brought the infrastructure with them. The initial landing waves included bulldozers, graders, rollers, and earth-moving equipment that had been preloaded on cargo ships specifically for this purpose. Where Japanese engineers might have relied on manual labor supplemented by a few pieces of heavy equipment, the Seabees arrived with an equipment density that reflected American industrial abundance. They had multiple machines for every job, spare parts stockpiled, and maintenance crews ready to keep equipment operational around the clock. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, commanding the 1st Marine Division, understood that air power would determine the campaign's outcome. He gave the airfield construction absolute priority, assigning security forces to protect the construction perimeter and ensuring that supplies for the engineers came before anything else. The Seabees worked in shifts, around the clock, using vehicle headlights when necessary to maintain progress through the tropical nights. This continuous operation shocked Japanese observers when they later captured American prisoners who described the work schedule. In Japanese military culture, night work was considered dangerous and inefficient, something done only in emergencies. The geology of Guadalcanal's Lunga Plain was both a blessing and a challenge. The area was relatively flat, requiring less grading than mountainous terrain, but the soil was a mixture of clay and volcanic material that became treacherous mud when wet. The Americans solved this problem with engineering speed that would have seemed impossible to Japanese planners. They scraped down to the coral substrate that lay beneath the topsoil, crushed the coral into gravel using portable crushing equipment, and spread it to create a surface that could support the weight of combat aircraft, even during the frequent tropical downpours. The Japanese had coral on their Pacific bases too, and they understood its value for runway construction. What they could not have anticipated was the scale and speed of American coral processing. Where a Japanese construction unit might crush several tons of coral per day using hand tools and small equipment, the Seabees' mobile crushing plants processed hundreds of tons per day. This was not a marginal difference in capability. It was an order of magnitude difference that reflected the industrial machinery gap between the two nations. By August 13th, 6 days after the landing, the runway was sufficiently complete to receive aircraft in an emergency. It was not finished, far from it, but it was functional. The Seabees had constructed a strip 4,800 feet long and 150 feet wide, surfaced with crushed coral that had been graded smooth and rolled hard. Fighter aircraft could operate from this strip immediately. Bombers would need a few more days as the engineers extended and strengthened the surface. On August 15th, Lieutenant William B. Freeman of Marine Air Group 23 personally flew a PBY Catalina flying boat onto the strip to verify its readiness despite having no actual need to land. The flight was purely a test. The runway passed. That same day, construction continued on taxiways, revetments for aircraft protection, and the beginning of fuel storage facilities. The Americans were not just building a runway. They were building an airbase with all the supporting infrastructure necessary for sustained operations. August 20th brought the official activation of the Airfield. 19 Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters from Marine Fighting Squadron 223 and 12 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Marine Scout. Bombing Squadron 232 landed at Henderson Field. These aircraft had flown from the escort carrier USS Long Island, which had been positioned within range specifically for this transfer. The sight of American aircraft operating from Guadalcanal, aircraft that could now strike Japanese shipping, support ground operations, and contest the airspace that Japan had controlled since December, represented a strategic turning point that Imperial headquarters was only beginning to comprehend. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft photographed the arriving American planes. The images were rushed to Rabaul, where senior officers gathered to study them in disbelief. Rear Admiral Sadayoshi Yamada, commanding the 25th Air Flotilla, personally examined the photographs with a magnifying glass, looking for evidence of deception. Perhaps the Americans had found a natural coral flat and merely cleared it. The photos showed otherwise. Clear evidence of extensive grading, organized drainage, and prepared revetments that could only have been deliberately constructed. The work was not crude or temporary. It was professional military engineering, completed in a time frame that violated every assumption about American capability. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The implications began to cascade through Japanese strategic planning like cracks spreading through glass. If the Americans could build a complete airfield in 11 days, what did that say about their ability to support offensive operations? If they had this much construction capability in a single division, what could they do with the full weight of their industrial economy? And most troubling, if the intelligence assessments had been this wrong about something as measurable as construction capacity, what else might Tokyo have miscalculated about American strength? Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, commanding the Japanese force being rushed to Guadalcanal to recapture the airfield, received updated intelligence about Henderson Field while his regiment assembled at Truk. The briefing described an operational airbase with approximately 40 aircraft, defensive positions, and supply dumps that suggested the Americans intended to stay. Ichiki's original orders had been based on the assumption that he would be attacking a Marine landing force still in the process of establishing a beachhead, vulnerable and disorganized. Now he was being sent to assault a fortified position with air support. Ichiki was a veteran of combat in China and the Philippines, confident in Japanese infantry tactics and contemptuous of American fighting spirit. He did not modify his attack plan despite the new intelligence about the airfield. The Bushido Code and his own combat experience told him that aggressive action and superior morale could overcome material disadvantages. His superiors in Rabaul shared this confidence. The Americans had machines and equipment, yes, but machines did not win battles. Determined men did. This belief was about to be tested on the banks of the Ilu River, where Ichiki's regiment would launch a night assault that would end in catastrophe. But the construction of Henderson Field had already accomplished something that the coming battle would only confirm. It had demonstrated that American industrial power was not just a matter of factories in Detroit and shipyards in California, though those were real enough.
The industrial power extended to the battlefield itself, manifest in the ability to reshape terrain, build infrastructure, and establish operational capability with a speed that rendered traditional military planning obsolete. The Japanese naval construction troops, who had been forced to evacuate Guadalcanal in early August, had left behind not just their tools and supplies, but their planning documents. American intelligence officers recovered these papers, which included detailed construction timelines and resource allocations for the airfield the Japanese had intended to build. The documents revealed that Japanese engineers estimated needing 6 months to complete the project, assuming supplies and reinforcements arrived on schedule. The Americans had done it in less than 2 weeks with the resources they brought in their initial landing. Major General Millard F. Harmon, commanding U.S. Army forces in the South Pacific, visited Henderson Field on September 8th and walked the runway with Marine engineers. He asked pointed questions about how they had accomplished the construction so quickly. The answers revealed a systematic approach to military engineering that was distinctly American. Extensive pre-planning, specialized equipment for every task, redundant machinery to ensure continuous operation despite breakdowns, and skilled operators who worked with an efficiency born from civilian construction experience. Harmon noted in his diary that night that the Seabees had brought American factory methods to jungle warfare. This was precisely what the Japanese high command had failed to anticipate. They had studied American military doctrine, analyzed American tactics from World War I, and assessed American industrial potential in terms of ships and aircraft that could be produced. But they had not grasped that the industrial mindset, the entire organizational culture of American productivity, would be applied directly to military operations in the field. The construction of Henderson Field was American mass production transplanted to Guadalcanal, with the same emphasis on speed, efficiency, and overwhelming resource application that characterized Detroit assembly lines or California shipyards. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Naito, a naval engineering officer attached to the 8th Fleet Staff in Rabaul, was assigned to analyze the Henderson Field construction after the photographs arrived. His report, submitted on August 23rd,
and later captured by Allied intelligence in 1943, provides a window into Japanese military thinking as it confronted evidence that contradicted doctrine. Naito began by noting that the observed construction timeline was incompatible with established engineering principles as understood by the Imperial Japanese Navy. He suggested three possible explanations. The Americans had secretly pre-positioned construction materials before the landing. They had employed Korean or Chinese labor at a scale
not detected by reconnaissance, or the photographs had been mislabeled and actually showed a later stage of construction than believed. All three explanations were wrong, and Naito's inability to consider the actual answer, that American construction methods were simply more efficient, revealed the cognitive box that Japanese planners had built for themselves. It was easier to believe in deception or hidden variables than to accept that the enemy possessed systematic advantages in engineering execution. Naito's report concluded with a recommendation that Japanese construction battalions adopt accelerated procedures for airfield construction, but he offered no specific suggestions for how to achieve this without the heavy equipment and skilled operators that the Americans possessed in abundance. The strategic situation in the Solomon Islands had been completely transformed by those 11 days of construction. Before Henderson Field became operational, Japanese naval forces controlled the waters around Guadalcanal during daylight hours, using land-based aircraft from Rabaul and naval air power to dominate the area. They ran supply missions at night, when their superior training in night naval operations gave them an advantage. The presence of American aircraft at Henderson fundamentally changed this calculus. Now Japanese ships approaching Guadalcanal faced air attack throughout the day. Supply runs became hazardous. Reinforcement schedules had to be planned around the radius of American air patrols. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commanding the 8th Fleet from Rabaul, understood immediately what the airfield meant for his operations. His cruiser force had won a stunning victory at the Battle of Savo Island on the night of August 8th and 9th, sinking 4 Allied cruisers in a night action that demonstrated Japanese naval tactical superiority. But that victory was now rendered almost meaningless. Without control of the air, without the ability to supply and reinforce the garrison on Guadalcanal freely, the tactical naval superiority counted for little. Mikawa began planning operations to neutralize Henderson Field, but every plan confronted the same problem. The Americans could repair and rebuild faster than Japanese naval bombardment could destroy. The Americans demonstrated this capability repeatedly in the coming months. When Japanese battleships Kongo and Haruna bombarded Henderson Field on the night of October 13th and 14th, they fired over 914-inch shells at the airfield and surrounding areas, destroying or damaging 48 aircraft and killing 41 men. The damage was severe, the worst single blow Henderson Field received during the campaign. Japanese planners believed the airfield would be out of action for days, possibly weeks. By the afternoon of October 14th, Seabees and Marine engineers had filled the craters, repaired the runway, and restored the field to operational status. Aircraft were flying combat missions less than 24 hours after one of the heaviest naval bombardments of the Pacific War. This resilience was not luck or heroism alone, though both played their part. It was the result of systematic American preparation and industrial logistics. The Seabees had stockpiled crushed coral, pre-positioned earth-moving equipment, and established repair procedures that treated crater filling as a routine operation rather than a crisis. They had backup generators for fuel pumps, spare parts for critical equipment, and a command structure that could shift seamlessly from construction to damage repair and back again. Captain Yasumi Toyama, commanding the Japanese transport operations to Guadalcanal, noted in his log that American engineering work proceeded with a mechanical efficiency that suggests they regard warfare as an industrial process rather than a test of warrior spirit.
Toyama meant this as criticism, an observation that Americans lacked the proper martial attitude. He did not recognize that he had identified precisely the source of American strength in this campaign, the willingness to treat war as a problem of logistics, organization, and industrial capacity, solvable through systematic application of resources and method. The Japanese attempted to match American construction speed in other areas of the Solomon Islands. On the island of Munda, they began building an airfield in November 1942, intending to create a base that could support operations against Henderson Field. Japanese engineers worked with typical dedication, but progress was agonizingly slow. Heavy equipment was scarce and had to be brought in by barge at night to avoid American air attack. Supplies came intermittently. The work proceeded in fits and starts, constantly interrupted by the need to take cover from air raids or suspend operations during American naval sweeps. What should have taken months took nearly a year, and by the time the Munda Airfield became operational in April 1943, the strategic situation had moved on. American forces captured the field in August 1943, and Seabees upgraded it within weeks to a level that Japanese engineers had never achieved. The pattern repeated across the Pacific theater as the war progressed. Wherever Americans landed, airfields appeared with a speed that Japanese planners could not match or counter. At Bougainville, American engineers carved an airfield out of swamp in even worse conditions than Guadalcanal, doing in weeks what seemed impossible. At Peleliu, at Guam, at Iwo Jima after its capture, the construction battalions demonstrated the same capability, the ability to create air power infrastructure faster than the enemy could destroy or prevent it. Japanese intelligence services eventually came to understand the source of American construction capability. By late 1943, interrogations of captured Seabees and examination of captured equipment manuals provided clear information about American construction organization and methods. But understanding the system did not mean Japan could replicate it. The industrial base, the skilled workforce, the abundance of heavy equipment, these were products of an entire economy organized around mass production and industrial efficiency. Japan could not conjure these advantages through doctrine or determination alone. The psychological impact of Henderson Field extended far beyond its operational value. 4 Japanese officers who had been taught that Americans were weak, individualistic, and lacking in martial discipline, the evidence of what had been built in 11 days created a cognitive dissonance that was difficult to resolve. Colonel Ichiki's contemptuous dismissal of the new intelligence about the airfield was not unique. It reflected a broader inability within Japanese military culture to revise fundamental assumptions even when confronted with contradictory evidence. On the night of August 21st, Ichiki led 917 men of his regiment in a frontal assault across the sandbar at the mouth of the Ilu River, attacking the Marine positions that protected Henderson Field's eastern perimeter. The Japanese soldiers advanced with the discipline and courage that had won victories across Asia, but they ran into defensive fire coordinated by radio, supported by artillery that had been pre-registered on likely avenues of approach, and reinforced by Marine reserves that moved into position using trucks that had been landed with the same logistical efficiency that built the airfield. The battle was a massacre. By dawn, over 770 Japanese soldiers lay dead on the sandbar and the beach beyond. Ichiki himself committed suicide when the scale of the defeat became clear. Fewer than 130 men from the regiment survived. The Marines who fought that night were impressed by Japanese tactical courage, but horrified by what they interpreted as senseless sacrifice. From the American perspective, Ichiki had thrown his men against a fortified position without reconnaissance, without artillery support, without any of the tactical preparations that modern warfare required. But Ichiki had been following Japanese doctrine. which emphasized aggressive action and offensive spirit as the keys to victory. The doctrine had worked in China, in the Philippines, in Malaya, because Japanese forces had enjoyed local superiority in training, experience, and often firepower. At Guadalcanal, they faced an enemy that matched their training, exceeded their firepower, and possessed logistical resources that made sustained combat operations possible in ways that Japanese forces could not replicate. The destruction of Ichiki's regiment forced Imperial headquarters to confront an uncomfortable truth. Retaking Guadalcanal would require a major operation, not the quick strike they had originally envisioned. Major Z. General Kiyotaki Kawaguchi was assigned to command the next offensive, arriving with approximately 6,000 men in early September. Kawaguchi was more cautious than Ichiki, conducting reconnaissance and planning a coordinated attack from multiple directions. But he too underestimated what he faced, not just the Marines defending Henderson Field, but the entire system of American military logistics that made their defense possible. Kawaguchi's forces attacked on the night of September 13th-14th in what became known as the Battle of Edson's Ridge, or the Battle of the Bloody Ridge. The fighting was desperate, with Japanese infantry penetrating Marine positions and coming within yards of breaking through to the airfield. But again, American logistics proved decisive. Marine artillery fired throughout the night, never running short of ammunition because supply ships had been able to land materiel without the constant threat of air attack that Japanese supply runs faced. Marine reserves moved into position using trucks that operated freely because Henderson Field's aircraft had established air superiority. When dawn came, Marine aircraft took off from Henderson Field and struck Japanese troops who were still trying to organize for another assault. The combination was overwhelming. Kawaguchi lost approximately 1,200 men killed and was forced to withdraw into the jungle. The reports that reached Japanese headquarters in Rabaul and then Tokyo described these battles in terms of American material advantages: the artillery, the air support, the mobility provided by motor transport. But the root of these advantages was the speed with which Henderson Field had been constructed, and the efficiency with which it was maintained and supplied. Every Japanese plan to retake Guadalcanal had to account for the presence of American air power operating from the island itself, and every such plan became exponentially more complex and resource-intensive. Commander Haruki Iki, a staff officer with the 11th Air Fleet, wrote in his personal journal after reviewing the reports from Guadalcanal, "We are discovering that American construction capability represents a form of military power that our doctrine never accounted for. They do not simply respond to our actions, they reshape the terrain itself to support their operations. How does one fight an enemy who can conjure airfields from jungle in less time than it takes to plan an offensive?" Iki's journal was recovered after the war and provides one of the most candid assessments of Japanese military thinking as it struggled with the implications of American industrial power. The Japanese High Command made a strategic decision in September to commit major resources to retaking Guadalcanal. The island had gone from being a minor position in the Solomon Chain to the focal point of the entire South Pacific campaign, and this escalation was directly attributable to Henderson Field. If the Americans held an operational airfield on Guadalcanal, they could interdict Japanese supply lines, support further offensives up the Solomon Chain, and threaten Rabaul itself. The airfield had to be recaptured or neutralized, regardless of cost. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, whose shocked reaction to the initial photographs opened this story, was given command of the 17th Army with orders to retake Guadalcanal. Hyakutake was a capable officer who understood logistics. He had served in staff positions overseeing supply operations and knew the challenges of supporting operations in the Pacific. His planning for the Guadalcanal offensive reflected this knowledge. He requisitioned additional transport ships, stockpiled supplies at forward bases, and developed a timeline for building up combat power on the island before launching the main assault. But Heikutake's logistics, efficient by Japanese standards, were operating in a different universe from American logistics. The United States Navy and Coast Guard operated a supply line to Guadalcanal that delivered thousands of tons of material weekly. Henderson Field served as both destination and protection for the supply line. Cargo ships could unload during daylight hours under the protective cover of fighter patrols from the airfield. Japanese supply runs, by contrast, had to be conducted at night using destroyers that could make high-speed runs down the slot, the channel through the Solomon Islands, deliver their cargo in the dark hours, and retreat before dawn, brought American air attacks. This method, which the Americans nicknamed the Tokyo Express and the Japanese called the Rat Run, could deliver troops efficiently enough, but was inadequate for heavy equipment, artillery, and the tons of supplies needed to sustain offensive operations. The mathematics of logistics increasingly favored the Americans as the campaign continued. For every ton of supplies that Japanese destroyers successfully landed on Guadalcanal, American transports landed 10 tons, 20 tons, sometimes more. This disparity was not the result of American ships being faster or more numerous alone, though both were true, but because Henderson Field's aircraft created a protective zone that made daylight operations possible. The airfield that had been built in 11 days was now generating strategic effects that compounded daily. Japanese plans to destroy Henderson Field became increasingly elaborate and desperate. In October, the combined fleet committed 2 battleships to bombard the field in what was intended as a decisive blow that would put the airfield out of action for weeks. The battleships Congo and Haruna, accompanied by a cruiser and 9 destroyers, steamed down the slot on the night of October 13th. The bombardment they delivered was devastating. 918 14-inch shells, plus over 2,000 shells from the cruiser and destroyers, all falling on Henderson Field and the surrounding area over 80 minutes of continuous fire. The destruction was immense. Aircraft were blown apart, fuel dumps ignited, ammunition stores exploded. 48 aircraft were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. 41 men were killed, and many more wounded. The Marine aviators who survived the bombardment emerged from shelters to find their airfield transformed into a moonscape of overlapping craters, burning wreckage, and destroyed facilities. It was the most severe damage Henderson Field sustained during the entire campaign. Japanese reconnaissance flights the next morning photographed the devastation and reported the field as completely non-operational. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet from his flagship Yamato, reviewed the photographs and permitted himself a moment of satisfaction. The expenditure of ammunition had been enormous, but Henderson Field appeared to be destroyed. Without air cover, the Americans on Guadalcanal would be vulnerable to Japanese reinforcement and counterattack. The investment had been worthwhile, but American engineers were already at work before the Japanese reconnaissance aircraft arrived. Seabees and Marine engineers had emerged from their shelters as soon as the bombardment ended and begun organizing repair operations while fires still burned around them. They had procedures for this, priorities for which craters to fill first, equipment assignments, supply dumps of crushed coral positioned for exactly this contingency. By dawn, bulldozers were pushing fill into the largest craters. By noon, a strip of the runway had been cleared and smoothed enough for emergency operations. By late afternoon, Marine fighters were taking off to intercept Japanese aircraft that had been sent to attack what was supposed to be a defenseless target. The Japanese pilots were shocked to encounter defensive fighters over Henderson Field. Their briefing had assured them the field was destroyed. Radio reports back to Rabaul created confusion. Had the battleship bombardment failed? had the reconnaissance photographs been misinterpreted. The truth was simpler and more disturbing. The Americans could repair in hours what Japanese planners assumed would take days or weeks to fix. The industrial efficiency that had built the field in 11 days was now demonstrated in its resilience. Captain Toshikazu Ohmai, a staff officer with the combined fleet, later wrote in his memoir that the October bombardment revealed a fundamental disconnect in Japanese strategic thinking. We measured success by the destruction we caused, but the Americans measured success by the time required to return to operations. We thought in terms of damage assessment. They thought in terms of repair timelines and resource allocation. These were two different philosophies of warfare, and theirs proved more practical. Major General Harukichi Hyakutake launched his main offensive on October 23rd with approximately 20,000 troops, the largest Japanese force committed to battle on Guadalcanal. The attack was carefully planned, with forces approaching from multiple directions to overwhelm the Marine perimeter and seize Henderson Field. Japanese artillery, brought ashore piece by piece over weeks of night deliveries, opened a preparatory bombardment. Infantry advanced with the discipline that Japanese training instilled, willing to accept casualties to achieve breakthrough. The offensive failed. It failed not because Japanese soldiers lacked courage, they displayed almost suicidal bravery, but because the Americans possessed overwhelming advantages in firepower, mobility, and supply. Marine artillery, never short of ammunition, fired tens of thousands of rounds during the 3 days of battle. Aircraft from Henderson Field struck Japanese troop concentrations and supply routes continuously during daylight hours. American forces could shift reserves to threaten points using trucks moving on roads that engineers had bulldozed, while Japanese forces struggled through jungle with hand-carried supplies. By October 26th, Hyakutake was forced to acknowledge failure. His forces had lost approximately 3,500 men killed and were too weakened to continue offensive operations. The Marines lost approximately 86 men killed, a casualty ratio of approximately 40-1 that reflected not differences in fighting spirit, but differences in the industrial capacity supporting each force. Japanese wounded often died from lack of medical supplies that could not be delivered. Japanese artillery fell silent when ammunition ran out and could not be resupplied. Japanese troops went on half rations and then quarter rations because the Tokyo Express could not deliver food in sufficient quantities. The contrast with American logistics was stark. Henderson Field received regular supply flights in addition to sea transport. Wounded Marines were evacuated by aircraft to rear area hospitals. Ammunition was abundant enough that Marine artillery developed a reputation for profligate expenditure, a luxury that came from never having to worry about resupply. Hot food was served to frontline units daily, using field kitchens that could operate because fuel was plentiful. This was not because individual American soldiers were better supplied than individual Japanese soldiers, though they were, but because the entire logistical system supporting American operations functioned at a scale and efficiency that Japanese logistics could not match. The cumulative effect of these logistical disparities was decisive. By November 1942, Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were starving. Soldiers' diaries captured after the campaign's end describe men reduced to eating grass, roots, and leather equipment. Disease ravaged units as malnutrition weakened immune systems. Combat effectiveness collapsed. Not because Japanese soldiers had stopped fighting. Many units maintained discipline and cohesion to the end, but because they lacked the basic sustenance to function as a military force. American forces, meanwhile, were expanding Henderson Field. The Seabees constructed additional runways, built extensive revetments for aircraft protection, developed fuel storage facilities that could support an entire air group,
and created maintenance shops with tools and parts to keep aircraft operational. By December, Henderson Field had grown from the initial 4,800-foot runway built in 11 days to a complex of 2 runways, extensive taxiways, and support structures that represented the sort of airbase that pre-war planning would have estimated taking 6 months to construct. The expansion continued throughout the campaign, with improvements and additions being made even while combat operations continued. Major John L. Smith, commanding Marine Fighting Squadron 223, kept detailed notes on the field's development. He described watching Seabees work through Japanese artillery fire, pausing only when shells landed nearby and then resuming immediately. He noted that construction equipment operators showed the same matter-of-fact professionalism under fire that they presumably had shown on civilian construction jobs. This was work, dangerous work certainly, but work that needed to be done according to schedule. Smith wrote, "They approach war as a construction project with hostile interruptions, rather than as combat operations with construction requirements. The difference in mentality is subtle but significant. The Japanese never adjusted their logistics to compete with American supply efficiency. They could not. Their industrial base, merchant marine, and strategic position did not permit the concentration of resources that American logistics demonstrated. But beyond material limitations, there was a conceptual barrier. Japanese military culture valued fighting spirit, tactical skill, and operational daring. Logistics was a necessary but unglamorous support function, not something that commanded the same respect as combat prowess. The idea that warfare could be decided by construction speed and supply throughput did not fit comfortably in a military tradition that emphasized samurai virtues and spiritual strength. Commander Wataru Yamagata, a logistics officer with the 17th Army Staff, submitted a report in November analyzing American supply operations on Guadalcanal. His report estimated that American forces were receiving approximately 100 tons of supplies per day through a combination of sea and air transport. He noted that this figure exceeded Japanese supply deliveries by a factor of 10 or more, and observed that the disparity was growing rather than shrinking. Yamagata concluded that retaking Guadalcanal was logistically impossible without a fundamental change in Japanese supply capabilities or a successful interdiction of American supply lines, neither of which appeared achievable. The report was accurate but unwelcome. Imperial headquarters was not prepared to accept that a battle could be lost primarily due to logistics rather than tactical or operational failures. Senior officers searched for other explanations: inadequate fighting spirit, poor tactical execution, insufficient commitment of naval forces. These explanations were more acceptable because they suggested problems that could be fixed through better leadership or greater effort. Accepting that American industrial logistics represented an insurmountable advantage would have required rethinking the entire strategic basis of the war, and by November 1942, Japan was too committed to change course. On December 9th, Emperor Hirohito approved the decision to evacuate Japanese forces from Guadalcanal. The operation was disguised as a reinforcement to maintain morale, but the reality was retreat, the first major Japanese withdrawal of the war. The evacuation took place in early February 1943, with destroyers making high-speed runs to evacuate troops under cover of darkness. Approximately 10,800 men were successfully evacuated from the original force of approximately 36,000 that had been committed to the island. The rest had been killed in action, died of disease or starvation, or were captured. The campaign for Guadalcanal had lasted 6 months from the initial American landing. During that time, Henderson Field had been attacked by air, by sea bombardment, by ground assault, and by constant Japanese efforts to render it inoperable. It had never been out of action for more than a few days at most, and usually for only hours. The airfield built in 11 days had proven more durable and valuable than entire divisions of troops. Its construction had been the decisive event of the campaign. Everything else followed from that initial engineering achievement. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.